It's the fourth day of our series, What's at Stake? Today, we're turning our eye to trade. Agreements with South Korea, Panama, and Colombia have remained untouched since they were put together by former President George W. Bush. Now, if Republicans take a majority in the House come November 2nd, will there be movement afterward? And of course, you've got to talk about China and trade issues on that front. So joining me now to discuss what's next is Greg Mastel. He's managing director of Dutko Worldwide, veteran of Capitol Hill. He was chief economist and chief international trade advisor to the Senate Finance Committee and former chief of staff to Senator Max Baucus. Greg, welcome to InBusiness. So we just listed those 3 free trade agreements that have been stalled. What gets done?
Well, good question. This has been a very slow 2 years for international trade. For the U.S., no new agreements. In the Congress, no major trade legislation at all has passed. And as you pointed out, these 3 major FTAs with important allies have been sitting for about 3 years, essentially done, and waiting for congressional action. President Obama said some positive things about them, but hadn't sent them to Congress for approval yet.
Well, we do know that President Obama has said he wants to double export over the next 5 years.
Right.
Theoretically, free trade would help that. But one of the reasons, or one of the reported reasons, that these agreements have stalled is because of, particularly among the Democratic leadership, opposition to treatment of unions in countries like Colombia. What changes? Does a Republican House mean that these agreements do go through, particularly with Colombia and South Korea?
Well, if you look at it from the big picture, trade would be one of the few issues where President Obama can make some peace with a Republican Congress or a Republican House. Historically, Republicans have been pro-free trade, and they probably are particularly positively inclined toward agreements negotiated by President Bush. So I think there's a good chance that they could agree to move these agreements forward. And frankly, a Republican Congress is probably an easier sell on free trade than a Democratic Congress.
We've got to think that South Korea at least is going to be discussed, right? I mean, the G20 is there.
Right.
Leadership will be there next month. So at least on that front, you willing to say South Korea's FTA gets approved?
Absolutely. South Korea's FTA is by far the biggest of the 3 that are out there in economic terms. President Obama has said positive things several times about the agreement. There are some details in autos and beef that this administration is trying to wrap up, but it shouldn't be a long negotiation, so it's something that can be done fairly quickly. I think if you really want to double exports, agreements like the South Korea FTA are a really important part of the picture.
Well, China obviously is the behemoth on the trade front that we've been talking about, and the presumption here that you might see a currency dispute turn into a trade war. But it's not just the currency that's an issue there. What gets done, perhaps, to compete with China's very low wages, their massive infrastructure advantage? I mean, how do you actually, and can you actually see a balancing of the trade between the U.S. and China?
Well, China is the 800-pound gorilla of the trade debate in the United States. It really does shape perceptions in Congress and the public and really everywhere. The currency issue is an important one, and it's one that's coming to a boil. The Obama administration, like the Bush administration before it, has tried to keep the currency issue kind of on low boil, talking to the Chinese in the background, using quiet diplomacy. I think the Congress is losing patience with that. You may have seen last week the trade deficit with China hit a new record. The House has already taken some action on China.
Right.
I think this is an issue that the next Congress is likely to take up no matter who controls the Congress. And it's more a matter of the Obama administration struggling with the Congress for control of policy.
Well, yeah, and that issue of control, obviously the buck stops at the president's desk, but the fact that
Right.
Congress is going to be talking about this, and this idea that there's perhaps a new round of protectionism out there, what's your worry? What's your risk?
Well, I think words like protectionism don't fit very well in this debate because, in a sense, what Congress is trying to do is deal with a kind of Chinese protectionism, that is, holding their currency down to very low artificial levels. Unfortunately, nobody has a magic bullet to solve the problem with China. I mean, there's no agreement, there's no policy, there's no law that changes things up immediately. But this is probably the biggest single trade issue on the agenda for the next Congress, and probably one that President Obama and the Congress will have to deal with.